Good morning, everybody. It's great to see you this morning. Thanks for being out on this beautiful Lord's Day, and thanks for being here for this time of Bible study where we can learn more of God's Word and encourage one another as we study the Scriptures. We are, in this Sunday morning class, we're talking about the Sermon on the Mount, and we're following through Matthew's account of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, and we're in chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7 is where our study continues this morning. We're talking about a section that contains a verse that is, in my guess, is probably the most known verse in the New Testament, especially by people who don't know anything about the Bible. Matthew 7, verse 1, judge not that you be not judged. I tell you, you can talk to a guy who hasn't touched a Bible in the last 25 years, and he knows that statement, judge not that you be not judged. I mean, everybody knows that. And of course, what they want to do, what they want to use that for is just to turn you off, turn you away, reject anything that you have to say about them and their life and what they're doing and their need for repentance and obedience. Just blow that off completely by saying, judge not, that you be not judged. That's what you know. So we have talked about this, of course, so many times through the years. And I think it is very important for us to be able to properly explain this section, because it does not forbid judging. It forbids a kind of judging, but it does not forbid all judging. And the verse that I have, one of the verses that I have in the margin of mine, and we talked about this just briefly last week as the class was ending, John 7, verse 24. And our author mentions that in introduction to this section on judging. Judge not according to appearance, but judge righteous judgment. We are to judge righteous judgment. That's actually an instruction. We're commanded to judge righteous judgment. So whatever twist or turn you want to put on this section here in Matthew 7, you got to take it in conjunction with so much else that's said in the New Testament that does not forbid all judging. Therefore, we got to help people understand what the proper meaning of the text is. Let's read it again. We're in Matthew 7, beginning verse 1. Judge not that you be not judged. For with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged, and with what measure ye mete, it shall be measured to you again. And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Or how wilt thou say to thy brother, let me pull out the mote out of thine eye, and behold, the beam is in thine own eye? Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thine own eye, then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye. Give not that which is holy unto the dogs, neither cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn again and rend you. All right, so our author suggested that there's a lot more to this than verse 1, obviously. And he asked question 2, what further teaching in these verses indicates that we must exercise some form of judgment? What's in the text? It says, the text actually says to judge, doesn't it, Tom?
Well, actually, the next two verses sort of set a standard. It goes back there to verse 2. It says, for in the way you judge, you will be judged. Right? So, if you're not judging fairly, God's going to hold that standard against you.
Okay.
And then it says, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. So the question is, what is your measure of standard? If it's God's measure, then you're judging correctly.
Okay.
If it's not God's measure, then, what do you really have to go on except your own opinion and your own, philosophy?
Okay.
And that's the biggest problem that everybody makes is they quote that first verse and says, well, that covers it. No, but a lot of times Scripture, interprets Scripture, and here it does very well.
Yeah. Jeff?
Looking at the spec.
Yeah.
Observing the spec, he's making a judgment.
Exactly. And when he says in verse 5, you will be able to see clearly to cast the mote out of thy brother's eye. Well, that would indicate I'm making a judgment. I'm taking care of my own issues first, but he does not excuse me. So my brother's got a speck in his eye. I've got a beam in my eye. Certainly take care of that problem first. But don't ignore, he's not telling you ignore the speck in your brother's eye. Even that implies you would make a judgment about that, JD.
Just kind of reminds me of the parable of the debtor. So there is a person who was forgiven his great debt by his master. Of course, the master had every right to send him to debtor's prison or do whatever he wanted. But then he turns around and goes out and his fellow servant, and so basically that whole deal of when we think about what judgment we use, well, he just been greatly forgiven of something, but yet he turns around and I guess when you're thinking about it in a thing of judgment, you're being very harsh on someone when you're not taking perspective of your own self.
Right. And that parable and this statement by Jesus, Jesus was able to paint word pictures that just stick in your mind, don't they? And this one, I mean, literally, when it says, and I'm reading King James, of course, and it uses the word mote, where I think Jeff suggested other versions will say speck. It's just a little speck, versus a beam. And that word means literally a beam, like a log sticking out of your eye. Jesus intended that to be that graphically extreme to drive his point home. You got big issues. Don't be going around trying to correct other people's issues when you got big issues yourself that you haven't taken care of, Matt.
I always think it's funny that people use this verse to condemn you for judging or doing the very thing that is condemning here. I always tell people, I say, are you judging me for judging you?
Yeah.
They're like, what?
Yeah. They don't get that, but that's what they're doing, isn't it? Exactly right. Tom?
And then you go to other places, that God speaks his judgment very plainly. When there's, Paul's letters, a lot of times Paul says, if you did this, you have no part in heaven. And that's a judgment.
Yeah.
So the question is, you're examining yourself. Am I an adulterer? Am I a liar? Am I a drunk? Well, if I am, I don't have any place in heaven.
Yeah.
I need to change. I need to quit being that. And that's what Paul was always. So he was, just stating, by being an inspired speaker, he was stating God's judgment right away. And a lot of people ignore that. They want to go through and say, well, I sort of want to do what I want to do. And it's that Burger King philosophy that, have it your way. You only want to do what you want to do. You don't want to be held to God's standard for what, he says.
Yeah. What about verse 2? Now you're gonna have to help me with verse 2, because verse 2, here's my take on verse 2. With what judgment you judge, ye shall be judged. With what measure you meet, it shall be measured to you again. So I'm going to do zero, absolutely no judging whatsoever, and therefore then nobody can throw judgment at me, right? Is that the proper interpretation of that? So, with what judgment you judge? In my case, I'm not going to do just absolutely zero judging. I'm not going to do any judging, because then what I want is nobody can judge me, because I didn't judge anybody else. Nobody can judge me. Is that the twist we're going to put on this?
No, because verse 5 destroys that.
Okay. Even in the context, right? Even in the context, it goes on to discuss the necessity of judging. And really, sometimes we point out later in this same chapter, within the same sermon, if you get down to verse 15, beware of false prophets which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. Ye shall know them by their fruits. That would be judging, wouldn't it? So the very context of this says you're going to be judged and you must make judgments. This is just saying use the proper standards of judgment. And by all means, don't be a hypocrite in your judgment. When you've got huge issues yourself, that specifically here, I think, is the case of people who have huge issues of their own that they're not addressing, but they want to talk about everybody else's problems. And here Jesus specifically says, here's people with a big problem in their life, and they're focusing on little problems in other people's lives. And he didn't say ignore the other person's problems, but he says take care of your own first. Dale?
Very good. There makes me think of, Jesus is down on the ground, right? When they picked the stone this woman for her sins. And, they all had to agree to, smash her. And, Jesus was sitting down there and he was writing on the ground. That's what makes me think, that he knew that they all had things that they wanted.
Yeah, I've read after commentators, because we wouldn't know for sure, but I've read after commentators who say he was writing in the dirt. He was writing a list of sins. It wouldn't be hard to believe. I mean, we couldn't prove it, but it wouldn't be hard to believe. But
They had a harsh thing, they were going to stone her, so you know, that makes me think, you know, what the days are.
yeah. I think this passage is really easy to understand. I just don't think that we have any problem with that. But what about, and our author asked this, in what sense might God judge us? I'm looking at question 5 actually. In what case or sense might God judge us based on the manner of our judgment toward others? Now, that last part of verse 2 is clearly, with what measure you meet, it shall be measured to you again. So, how am I at jeopardy here? What would be the sense? And that's the way he worded it. What would be the sense that God might judge us on the manner of our judgment of others?
Well, later on in Matthew 18, Jesus talked about not showing mercy.
Okay.
If you don't show mercy, God will show mercy to you. So there's a parallel.
Yeah, I think that's it. And I had written down James 2, verse 13, which says the same thing. In James 2:13, he shall have judgment without mercy that hath shown no mercy, and mercy rejoiceth against judgment. And so if I've been very harsh and hard-hearted in my treatment of others, there's a warning here that I could receive that same sort of treatment from God. And I can't afford that, right? I'm not going to be able to stand. If I have not been merciful, then I will not pass God's judgment without his mercy. And if I have not shown mercy, and therefore God does not extend mercy to me, I'm in a bad shape. So I really think there's two components to the kind of judging that Jesus is condemning here. One is a very harsh, merciless kind of judging, which the Pharisees were bad to do, right? The Pharisees were bad to do that kind of judging. The other is, which I think is the main emphasis of the verses, is the gross hypocrisy, wherein I've got tons and tons and tons of problems of my own, and I won't take care of them, but I'm going to make sure that the other guy, I'm telling him all his faults and pressing him about all of his faults. I really think that those are the kinds of judging that we're being told to avoid here. Are we guilty of it? You think I don't have that problem. That's not a problem with me. Anybody who says that is probably not analyzing themselves very well, because I think we're all inclined to harsh and sometimes hypocritical judgments of others. That and you have probably seen it as I have seen it in the Lord's church, where people will criticize others for doing the very thing that they're doing. And so we got to be careful about it. I don't think these are wasted words on us. I think this is very applicable to our situation. Any thoughts, Tom?
Jesus goes through a number of times, basically places judgment against the scribes and the Pharisees and things. He labeled them hypocrites. He had some very colorful words for them, like you are whitewashed tombs. Those are forms of judgment because they're going through and identifying a particular character or flaw that they have in it. Now Jesus is at a point where he can make those judgments because he knew all the hearts of men and things. But here people want to go through it. They come back and say, see, Jesus shouldn't have been making those judgments. He was. Why should he call those Pharisees whitewashed tombs? Did he know each and every one of them? There's that concept that goes through that people want to put their standards on everything.
Okay. I do think that Jesus' strongest condemnations were always against hypocrites. Hypocrisy seemed to receive Jesus' strongest words of rebuke. Yeah?
Well, I was just going to thought in mind, this is as old as time as human behavior to do what you were talking about. David did this.
Yeah.
When the prophet had to come and rebuke him, he so easily saw the sin.
That guy who stole that lamb.
Absolutely, but he was blind to his own sin.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we do that. So we need this.
Yeah. It sure is applicable in all times. I think it's applicable to us. And to what extent that we can improve in this, we improve our relationships with one another. So if you have an issue and I need to come to you about this issue, which I should, but if I'm careful not to be a hypocrite in approaching, in other words, whatever the sin is, I make sure that in my life I've corrected the sins in my life, so I'm able to help you with the sins in your life. Our relationships are better when we follow this principle, for sure. The author asked about, I thought it was a little curious in question 6. He talked about the humor of Jesus in verse 4 when he talked about the speck and the beam. I guess you could use the word humor there. I've read after people who tried to go through the teachings of Jesus and identify different humorous things that he said. I don't know that when I think of Jesus, I don't think of a person trying to be humorous. I would take this as hyperbole, exaggeration for emphasis. And Jesus often did that. If you try to picture this in your mind, it's almost like a political cartoon in the newspaper. You can see that guy with a big log sticking out of his eye, and he's down here trying to pick a little speck out of somebody else's eye. You can see it. I don't think it was meant to be humorous. I think it was meant to drive the point home. Any thoughts on that? All right. I think we've pretty well covered those things, but I would emphasize again in verse 5, this whole section is not condemning judgment and is not excusing us from our duty toward others who have issues. Because we're supposed to, at the end of verse 5, you'll be able to see clearly to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye. I should be worried about my brother. And even just a speck in his eye, I should be concerned about that, but only after I've addressed my own situation. So again, we know this passage pretty well. We've talked about it a lot. It's self-explanatory. It really is self-explanatory. I can't imagine why it has become such an abused text, other than just that first phrase in verse 1 is the one people want to latch onto. Now, verse 6, and our author included it in this section. It's probably sort of a separate paragraph, a little bit of a secondary thought. Give not that which is holy to the dogs, neither cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn again and rend you. Well, that would require judging, wouldn't it? So I've got to judge that this guy is not receiving what I'm offering, and trying to talk to him any further is the equivalent of casting pearls before swine. Well, I'd have to make a judgment in that, right? So even that, in the context, would say not all judging is being forbidden. What about that? Here's this guy, and I have been trying to reach him with the gospel for a while now. I've made several approaches to him, several attempts to try and reach him with God's truth. And he had just been rejecting. He actually has gotten kind of mad and hostile. He's used bad words to get rid of me. Last time I talked to him, he actually threatened me. When do I make that judgment that any further effort to reach him is pearls before swine? Got any guidelines on that? Matt?
Well, I think, if we push issues, sometimes we become, we're not looking for, it's the opposite of our means. He's pushing us away. We ought to always leave a door of opportunity open. If somebody's willing to come and listen, something happens in their life. But at some point, we're pushing them away more than we're trying to draw them to Christ if we persist in trying to force an issue. There comes a time when we got to say, you know what, we just got to make that judgment call. I'm doing more harm than good. He doesn't appreciate these things, doesn't care for these things. Maybe something will change down the road, but if I keep pushing the issue, I'm gonna slam that door shut rather than leaving the opportunity open.
I think you used the right expression there when you said it's a matter of judgment. And so my judgment toward this particular individual might be different than your judgment toward this particular individual, but it is a matter of judgment. I think in matters of judgment, what we do is what James suggests in James 1 verse 5, pray for wisdom. I need to pray for wisdom. But there is a point, there is some point with a person wherein I say, I'm not doing any good here. I'm not going to be able to do any good, at least not at this time. And so I'm going to quit. I'm going to address my energies and effort someplace else. I'm not going to continue to try and change that guy. He has not been receptive. And my judgment at this point is that I'm casting my pearls before swine. Now that might change. It might or it might not change, but it might change in the future. But right now, that's my judgment for this time. And so I think Jesus here gives us a license to make such judgments as that. Yeah, I think he's saying you'll have to make such judgments as that. Pray for wisdom to make the right judgment. I would suggest that we shouldn't be too quick to pull that trigger, but at some point, that's a legitimate thing to do, right? Jeff?
Err on the side of caution.
Yeah.
It's wrong to stop too soon, but it may not be wrong to keep going until you're fully convinced.
Right. Dale?
Still, like Matt said, though, instead of pushing him so hard, you might have to ease up, just try to talk to him or be friendly to him and say, hey, I'm just praying for you or something like that. Kind of back off a little bit and let him see that you're still concerned with him where he'll come to you if he doesn't.
Yeah. And I think that's right. Let him know that you're still concerned. And Matt used the idea of keeping a door open there. So if this guy were to change in the future, I want him to know that he could always talk to me about such things. I've not slammed the door on him to where I don't. But at the same time, my energies are going to be directed elsewhere. All right. And then the final point in this section that our author makes is that we have examples of Paul making such judgment. We don't need to take time to read them, but he mentions Acts 13, beginning verse 45, and Acts 18, beginning verse 5, where in both instances, Paul had gone to the Jews in the synagogues. In the first city, it was Antioch, chapter 13, and in Acts 18, it was in Corinth. And in both instances, he had gone to the synagogues of the Jews, and they rejected him. And he says, I turn to the Gentiles. In both instances, he said, I think there in Acts 13, he says, you judge yourselves unworthy of the gospel. I go to the Gentiles. And so, Paul's an example of one who had to make that sort of a judgment call. Tom?
Some of that, there's a amount called limited commission, and then, they don't reject you, they don't accept you, shake the dust off your sandals, and, sort of, lead them to their own means, because they're not willing to hear you.
Yeah.
So, it's not just Paul, but, the whole teaching of God goes through, falls on that. Sometimes, you just, people are just not going to receive you, so why do something, why keep pushing something holy to somebody that's not going to accept it? Sometimes it's sort of like this concept that you need to go into, these saloons and everything and preach to these drunks. Well, that's probably not the wisest thing to do, to go in there and start teaching, Jesus to a bunch of people that are drinking and are drunks. Basically, why they went there for that whole purpose. So are you just sort of semi-wasting your time and trying to do that? It's not a very good judgment call to go through trying to do it.
Okay. A couple of times recently, in regards to some people who passed away, something was said about, what about that guy? Maybe we didn't try hard enough. And there were two specific things, conversations that I was recently involved in. And I said concerning the two individuals that were under consideration, I don't feel guilty about them. I don't feel guilty about them. I feel like they had more than adequate chance to do right and make their life right, and we gave them every opportunity to see a better way and pursue a better course. And so, you know, that's good to be able to say, I don't feel like we were negligent in regards to that individual. Now, there's a lot of people that I feel worried. I'm concerned about a lot of people that I don't think maybe I tried hard enough to reach. But there's some individuals who you just know they had the chance and they didn't pursue the chance. I'm not going to worry about that anymore. I tell you, in the course of those conversations, it came up about the song that we sing. I can hardly sing it. You Never Mentioned Him to Me. That is a hard song to sing. I mean, because there are so many people who, on the judgment day, could point their finger at me and said, you never mentioned him to me. And that's the ones I'm concerned about. But there are some people who we made every effort and tried hard, and we finally just had to say that was pearls before swine. Okay, that's okay. Jesus said we could do that. He gave us that opening. Judgment call, but I think sometimes that judgment is well deserved. Anybody else? Anything? All right. That leads us to a few verses now about the importance of persisting in prayer. Beginning at verse 7. Ask and it shall be given you. Seek and ye shall find. Knock and it shall be opened unto you. For everyone that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. Or what man is there of you, whom if his son ask bread, will give him a stone, or if he ask a fish, will give him a serpent? If ye then, being evil, know how to give good gifts unto your children, how much more shall your Father which is in heaven give good things to them that ask him? All right. So, of course, verse 7 famously says, ask, seek, knock. Ask and it will be given. Seek, you shall find. Knock, it'll be opened unto you. Based upon that, and again, what we got to be really careful about is snatching these expressions out of the context in which they're found. Based upon that, what should be my expectation in regards to receiving things from God? You know, I asked for $1 million recently, and I haven't got it. I wonder what's going on there, because I thought if I ask, I would ask and ye shall receive. It'll be given. Ask and it'll be given you. I asked. What's going on here? Anybody? Dale?
I think we need to think about what God wants us to have. When you say, in God's will, in your will, everything be done. He might not want us to have that $1 million because he knows how we're going to act. So the things that we ask for sometimes need to be, realistic.
Okay. All right, I think that's true. And in a follow-up question down there under letter C in our study, or letter E rather, in our study guide, verse 8 does the promise of verse 8 mean we'll receive exactly what we ask for? Verse 8 says, for everyone that asketh receiveth, he that seeketh findeth, to him that knocketh it shall be opened. But the question asked is, does that mean he receives exactly what he asked for? That he finds exactly what he was seeking? That the door that's open to him is the door he wanted to be opened? And I think the point there is that's not necessarily so. I know we've said so many times, God answers prayers, but the answer may not be yes. It may not be the answer that we directly wanted. There's a promise here of God hearing prayers and responding to our prayers, but it's not necessarily that we will receive exactly what we thought was the right thing. And he references James 4 verse 3. James 4 verse 3 says, ye ask and receive not, because you ask amiss, that you may consume it upon your lust. And so there's elsewhere in the scriptures we're warned about selfish asking that will not be answered. So again, here in our study text in Matthew 7, I think we have to say it's not an unconditional promise that we'll receive exactly what we're asking for. All right, Bobby?
You know, Jesus said in one place, I think it's in Matthew chapter 12 and Luke chapter 12, where he said, I think they call the Lord of heaven and earth, that thou hast hid these things from the wise and the prudent, and hast revealed it unto babes. For thus it seems good in thy sight.
Okay.
So if we want to understand the Bible, we can, but it's hid from a lot of people.
Okay. But the expression there, what's good in His sight, is the key, because God's going to, and He goes on here in the context to say, that God is a loving Father, and He gives good things to them that ask Him. That $1 million I was asking for is probably not at all a good thing for me. As Dale was saying earlier, that'd probably wreck me and ruin me. And God knows that. And so as a loving Father, He doesn't give me. So, and He says, compare that to an earthly father. An earthly father wants to do what's in the best interest of his child, right? And if fallible human fathers want to act in the best interest of their children, how much more so God? So I ask for $1 million. God knows that that's just a ruination. And He's not going to answer yes to that. But He'll give me what I do need. He'll give me good gifts. He'll give me what's best for me. Tom?
Are these just open-ended things? Doesn't matter what you ask for. Doesn't matter what you seek for. Doesn't matter what you not for. Jesus is trying to be pretty specific in, asking for the right things, seeking for the right things, and knocking, for the, on the right doors, have them open to you.
Yeah.
And sometimes we ask for the wrong things, expecting to get it, and then are disappointed because they're not provided for us.
Yeah.
So there's a positive aspect of asking for the right thing, so that it'll be given unto you. Seeking the right things so you can find it, and knocking on the right doors so they'll be open to you.
I agree. And don't forget that the thrust of this whole Sermon on the Mount has been about spiritual things. And so here, going all the way back to the Beatitudes at the very start of the sermon, chapter 5, verse 4, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Mourning over our sins. Verse 6, blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Desiring to be right with God. The thrust of the sermon is with a spiritual emphasis, seeking those spiritual things. And so I think it would be appropriate here to analyze this not purely from a physical perspective. I wanted $1 million. I wanted a new car. Well, if we're getting the gist of what Jesus is saying all through the sermon, that's not even on the radar screen here. What I should be asking for is spiritual strength, ability to resist temptation, opportunities to teach lost people the gospel. And if I ask for good things, God will give me good things. He's a loving Heavenly Father. He gives good things to them that ask Him. Jeff, do you have a thought?
Earlier in chapter 6, you were talking about things God, He knows we need these things.
Yeah.
The discussion there was about what to eat, what to wear.
Yeah.
The driving force behind prayer, 1 John 5:14, ask according to His will.
Yeah.
If you don't know the Father's will, then you're going to ask wrong, and you're going to ask for the wrong thing. If I'm aware of what my Father's will is for me, then more than likely I will pray for it, and I'll ask for things that will help me the most.
Exactly right. That's right. Dale?
Greg, I worked with a guy in WW, who had a lot of money on the big trucking company. His dad left everything he had to him, but he left it flawed. First thing he had to go to was business classes. And the second thing he had to go to was money management. Because he knew that if this boy gets his money, probably the first thing he's going to do, he's going to blow it all or do something crazy. So he put stipulations on what he had to do to inherit.
Okay.
So that's, kind of back to that $1 million thing. If we just get anything, we might not appreciate it, we might not need it.
Yeah. I think you're right. Actually, we had some guidelines on what to ask for in the same sermon, right? In the model prayer, if we go back to chapter 6, when we studied the model prayer, we saw what Jesus taught us to ask about. He taught us to ask for the furtherance of the kingdom. He taught us to ask for our daily bread. He told us we should ask for forgiveness and help dealing with temptation. Now, if you prayed that prayer, obviously we talked about the kingdom aspect of that prayer, but if you prayed for the things that are in that prayer, you think God would answer the prayer? Yeah, He would answer, right? And so, we don't have to be too much in doubt about what kind of things should we be asking for that God would respond favorably to. Because Jesus told us the kind of things to ask for. In the same sermon, in the model prayer, He gave a sort of a perfect example of the kind of things we ought to be asking for. And by the way, He said, ask for your daily bread. He didn't say ask for $1 million, right? So, and again, I would emphasize that statement in James chapter 4, verse 3. We can ask amiss, selfishly, to consume it on our lust, and God doesn't respond positively to those kinds of requests. So again, let the context explain the statement that could be snatched out of context and lead you to a completely wrong conclusion. If you just took verses 7 and 8, ask and it'll be given, seek ye shall find, knock it'll be open to you. If that was unconditional or categorical, we'd probably be in huge big trouble, but it's not. But again, maybe just the parting takeaway here is the description of God in verse 11. If ye then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more shall your Father which is in heaven give good things to them that ask Him? So, parents, fathers or parents in general, we know that we want what's best for our kids. And in fact, when our kids were growing up, they wanted some stuff that we didn't give them. Because sometimes it was stuff that we couldn't afford to give them even if we wanted to. But sometimes we just felt, for instance, I remember when Sarah was just about to turn 16, and she said, Dad, I'm going to be 16 on my next birthday, and I'm going to be wanting a car. And I remember telling her, I said, well, you better get a job. I said, I didn't give cars to your brothers, and I'm not giving a car to you. If you want a car, you better get a job and earn some money so you can buy a car. I thought that was best for her, right? Rather than just giving her a car, I said, work to earn some money. That was a parental judgment, which I made because I thought it was in her best interest. Well, this is what, if as a fallible father, I give and don't give. I give things to my kids that I think they need, and I don't give them things that I think might be harmful to them. If I, as a fallible human father, make those judgments, how much more so my Father in heaven, who's perfect and whose judgments are flawless, will give me the right things. It's a pretty neat picture, I think. Any other comments here? Jeff, got anything else? Okay. All right. Then verse 12, which we take typically as a standalone verse. Therefore, all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them, for this is the law and the prophets. We have referred to the golden rule, right? The so-called golden rule. Do unto others as you have others do unto you is the way we paraphrase it. It's a pretty wonderful concept. And what a world we would live in if everybody lived by that standard. It has always been the case that God expected that sort of behavior from His children. And our author references some Old Testament passages in where that general concept was also there. So this is actually not a brand new thought, but the Jews, particularly the Pharisees, had really forsaken that notion altogether. And so, do unto others as you have others do unto you is a great rule. And when Jesus says this is the law and prophets, he's even saying that notion was thorough in the Old Testament as well. I think I've told you before, on one of the first trips that we made to Russia, we were able to set up some lectures at the Moscow State University, and we had college students who were studying with us from the Scripture. These were a bunch of young people who had never, ever read the Bible. Many of them never even had touched a Bible. And so everything we were telling them was new. I mean, you and I have grown up with this so-called golden rule our whole lives, and we've always known that principle. But this was all new stuff to these college students we were studying with. And one of the preachers that was in our group, during the course of his lectures, he dealt with the Sermon on the Mount with a group of students who were interested in studying with him. And near the end of the lectures we were going to have, he asked these students who had been school trained from childhood to be atheists, and he just simply asked them, what would the world be like if everyone lived like this? And those kids, and it's not that they all, or any of them in that class, became Christians, but they were all quick to respond, it'd be a wonderful place if everyone lived like this. And it would be, right? And so, can I make it that way? I can't do it for the next guy, but I can do it for myself, right? I can live by the standard of treating others like I'd like to be treated. And if I did, for my part, I'd be making the world as good a place as I can make it by living according to that standard. Couple of things. I wish that we would apply this standard among ourselves as brethren. And we're not just talking about the world, people of the world. I should treat people of the world this way. I should treat my brethren in the church this way. And I'm going to tell you, sometimes we do not. Sometimes we do not treat one another as we would like to be treated. And that's a shame. That's a desperate shame when we don't. So, there's a good application of this in our immediate spiritual community. Let's treat one another like we'd like to be treated. Earlier in the chapter, let's judge one another like we'd like to be judged. Let's apply what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. It's so simple. My other thought about this is, though, what about this guy? All things whatsoever you would that men do to you, even so do you to them. So there's this guy, and he's breaking into my house, and he's attacking my loved ones. And so I defend myself and my family, and maybe I even take a gun and shoot him in self-defense. Now, that raises the whole broad question of self-defense. Can Christians defend themselves? That's a big question. We don't have time to dive into all that right here, but would I be doing unto others as I would have others do unto me if I defended myself against a violent aggressor? Would I be doing to others as I'd have others do unto me? Or should I just say, well, I'm going to have to let him do what he's going to do, because I wouldn't want anybody coming at me with a gun. What do you think?
I think this verse assumes all things are being equal, and his behavior falls over to an area where he has no business acting that way.
Yeah.
So that situation. This is not talking about a situation like that. I don't think.
Yeah.
This is talking about normal, everyday interactions and things that are honorable and good.
Okay.
And his action certainly is not that.
Okay, I agree with that. But I would even go just a little bit further than that. If I broke into somebody's house and was attacking somebody's family, I would expect him to come at me with a gun. And I would think he's perfectly within his rights to do so. So do unto others as you have. Yeah, he probably should. He probably should beat me with a bat if I'm in his house breaking up and pillaging and harming. So I'm like Jeff. I don't think this applies to that kind of thought at all. Dale?
It's always been my theory, you know, I want to treat this guy the way I want to treat him. And to me, it's come back to me because I've had 4 or 5 guys that's worked under me, that's ended up being my supervisor. And, you know, they end up treating me people that were, you know, I know guys that treated guys ugly, and as soon as some other guy got over him, you know,
Yeah.
okay, right.
Yeah. Yeah. It happens. It happens. It is it's sort of an obvious statement. So many of the truths in the Sermon on the Mount are so obvious that we ought to be able to see it just from a common sense point of view. But again, what a wonderful statement. You know, whatsoever ye would that men do to you, do ye even so to them. High standard to live by. It's a worthy standard to live by. All right, thanks everybody. Lord willing, we'll pick up the study there next week.